Okay, let's talk about shellfish. To start off, this is an image we took in the field working on clam gardens up in Quadra Island during the summer of 2019. What you see is a traditional shellfish basket made of, I think, willow and cedar roots. This basket was woven by Troy Olson and Bill James, and we actually watched that video from Bill James. And he gifted it to me about 2 years ago. We take it out in the field and when we do our work and harvest clams. And inside this bucket is a big pile of butter clams, Saxodomus gigantica, which we'll learn about, in addition to some other bivalve species. So the intertidal is an interesting place where it's this gradient between land and sea. And this is an idealized image of a soft substrate intertidal, meaning not rocky intertidal where you'd find a lot of small snails and limpets and things like that, but a softer, muddier beach. Locally, you could think of something like off Marine Park at Fairhaven, or Birch Bay is a good example of a place like this. This one has some kind of salt marsh plants up here as well, and then willow and alder in the upland. But we moved down this gradient from terrestrial to marine, and through this gradient you find a variety of organisms. And the way I like to think about it is every critter along this gradient has a Goldilocks zone. They have a perfect zone where they're happy, where if they go a little too high, they dry out and die. If they go a little bit too low, they often get eaten. And so in the intertidal, your zonation, the part of the intertidal zone that you live, is typically driven on the upper tide part by physical stress. You cannot live higher on the tide line because otherwise you'll dry out and die. If you live lower on the tide line, we think the lower limit for your tidal distribution is driven by biological impacts, primarily predation. So you're trying to, as a critter, live up high enough on the tide where the big mouths that live down lower in the ocean don't come eat you, but you're not trying to live too high on the tide where you dry out and die. And it's called desiccation, but drying out and dying. And so here in this zone, the water goes up and down every day. Not every day does it go all the way down to the low intertidal, but during certain times of the year, we have more extreme tides with higher highs and lower lows. So the tide does go up and down every day. In fact, here we've got what's called mixed diurnal tides, meaning we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. And it gets a bit confusing because you say things like, well, it's our higher high tide or our lower high tide or our higher low tide or our low tide. But effectively, you've got one low, like there's one lower low a day. And the lowest tides of the year occur around the summer and the winter solstice. In this part of the world, during the summer solstice, June, we have our lowest tides of the year, and they're during the day. During the winter solstice in December, we have the other set of the lowest tides of the year, and those happen at night. So it's kind of interesting about just how this works, and the fact that the gooey ducks, for example, you can't go dig those every day. There's only a few days of the year where the tide gets low enough way down here to where you're able to harvest gooey duck. There's a couple of species in this chart. I'm going to present kind of my favorite 10-ish bivalves that we'll talk about, some clams, a couple oysters, and I'll put them in the rough order that they exist from the upper tide to the low tide, and we'll walk through them in that order. So I'll present a species and that'll be a higher tide species, and then so on and so forth as we work our way down actually to the gooey duck, which is one of the lower tide clams. It lives in the very low tide line. Around here is what we call a -3 foot tide, down to subtidal and makes up a large actual biomass of Puget Sound. So these are the critters that kind of, along this gradient, but always when you walk in intertidal, think that every critter within intertidal has a narrow window of which it can survive. If it tries to move higher on that tide line, it's likely to dry out and die. If it moves lower on that tide line, likely somebody's going to eat it. So first clam we're going to talk about is the varnish clam. This is a non-native species for all of the clams and oysters we'll talk about. I'll note whether they're non-native or native. When we're talking about non-native species, there's a variety of terms we can use depending on whether or not we like them or not. Exotic, introduced, invasive, things like that. I'm just going to stick with native and non-native. They're from here or they're not. And varnish clams are definitely one that was introduced. Likely it came in on ballast water and is spread up and down the coast. You do find these in the supermarkets where they're called the purple varnish clam or the mahogany clam or the savory clam. They are way down on my list of species of things I want to eat. They live very, very high on the tide line. They're super weedy. On the Lummi Reservation alone, the estimates are 1 billion varnish clams. The most numerous clam on the Lummi Reservation is the varnish clam, a non-native introduced clam. You can eat them. They sell them in the stores. It's kind of funny because the local stores, when I see them, they often say farm raised, which is not true. All of the ones you'll see in the market are wild harvested, and then they're held at a aquaculture facility for a couple days to clean them out, and then they hit the shelves. And I've even Taylor will sell them, and I've spoken to folks at Taylor about that, and they're like, no, they're not farmed, they're wild harvested. And I've mentioned the stores that I see that, and they've never corrected it. It's a minutia, but it's like, to me, I was going to be interested if somebody's actually farming these things, because they exist in massive numbers naturally, and they have very low market value. So if you see like really cheap clams for sale at a market, likely the varnish clams. One of the reasons I am so negative on them, it's not just that they taste terrible, but they also can retain biotoxins longer than most of the other species we have in these waters. By biotoxins, I mean what you might have heard of red tides. So there's natural phytoplankton blooms. There's natural occurrences of little tiny microscopic plants that float around the ocean. Some of these microscopic plants, for whatever reason, decide to make toxins that can kill or harm people. And when we have a red tide event, or what we call in the business a harmful algal bloom, it creates toxins that clams consume, that clams take up in their tissue as they're consuming the phytoplankton. They're producing these toxins. Now, many clams flush out or break down those toxic compounds relatively quickly, maybe on the order of days or weeks. Well, our friend the varnish clam here can hang on to these toxins for much, much longer than anybody else. It can hang on to these toxins for really on the order of 6 months or longer, meaning that if it's December and you go out and dig clams in the middle of the night, we might not have had a red tide for 2 or 3 months, and you pick up some varnish clams and you take them home, you can still get sick from a red tide that happened during the summer. And so as you look at the regulations, there's a fair number of beaches that are permanently closed for varnish clams, but to be open for other species. It's just because these things hold on to toxins so long that the state says, just don't even mess with them. Just go get something else. It's a pretty interesting critter. Ecologically, they've kind of filled a niche where there's a number of diving ducks that will consume them because they're higher on the tide line. They're more accessible. But generally, these are kind of roundish, clammy looking things. You can see that the peristracum, or this organic layer on the outside, is chipping away. They're quite thin. You could kind of crush them with your fingers. So they're sort of a weak shell. They grow super fast. They spawn a lot. They make lots of offspring, and those offspring are very successful. Moving down the tide line, another critter that's near and dear to my heart is the Olympia oyster, Australodaria. The Olympia oyster is the only native oyster species on the west coast, and so if you've ever gone to a restaurant eating oysters, or you've ever gone to an oyster farm and eaten an oyster, there's a 99% chance you did not eat this one. You did not eat the Olympia oyster. The Olympia oyster was very abundant up until really the late 1800s. They started to have a massive decline, and that was largely driven by a few factors. One is the gold rush in California had a lot of miners with gold in their pockets, and for whatever reason they were anxious to turn that gold over for a fresh oyster, and so that drove the oyster market, doing a serial depletion of overharvesting all the oysters in San Francisco Bay and moving to the north and moving to the south and going from bay to bay to bay and wiping out all of the oysters to send them into San Francisco to feed miners. Secondly, the timber industry in its practices of dumping sawdust on the beaches suffocated a lot of the oysters. And there's a couple bad winters where during those December lows we had really cold winds and it froze a fair number of them. So this is the harvest data starting in about 1850 all the way through 1960. Willapa Bay is the dark circles and Puget Sound is the open circles. You can see that Willapa Bay was harvested out. People moved north to Puget Sound, which had lower populations. That peaks in just the early 1900s and then eventually down to nothing and crashing in the 60s. There's a number of restoration events or restoration programs going on for Olympia oyster. Locally, there's a restoration in Chuckanut Bay. There's a very successful restoration project in Fidalgo Bay near Anacortes, between Anacortes and March's Point. There's been some restoration work in Drayton Harbor, right on the U.S.-Canadian border. And there's a couple pockets here and there of work that's been done as well. There is a very small commercial aquaculture business around these. Taylor does raise some Olympia oysters, and so you can buy them for consumption, and they also raise a fair number for restoration efforts. And Acme Seafoods on Samish Island does a few as well. And that's more or less the extent of it. One of the issues why they're not so valuable in the market is these critters here you can see are about the size you would want in the half shell. However, these animals are probably 4 to 5 years old, where a comparably sized Pacific oyster, which we'll talk about in the next slide, may be 9 months old. So it just takes a very, very long time for them to grow to market size, as well as they don't close up as tightly, so they don't survive as long on ice. Then they have a different kind of brinier, more metallic flavor. I've only had them once or twice because they're kind of hard to find. But pretty interesting critters, the Olympia oyster. Next is the Pacific oyster. This is, when we think of oysters, this is the oyster you're probably thinking of. They were introduced. They were introduced actually for aquaculture. So as the Olympia oyster crashed, there was a big move to bring other oyster species in, and they brought in a boatload of oysters from Japan to try to grow them. Oddly enough, in Samish Bay, what's now the Taylor Shellfish Farm, just off Chuckanut Bay or off Chuckanut Road, that was the first place Pacific oysters touched ground in this area. And they brought over a boatload of them, and they all arrived dead. So they just dumped them in the water and forgot about it. Well, what happened was the large individuals, the adults, stressed and died on the trip, but the juveniles actually survived, and so they grew and began spawning, and that population then wound up being the initial seed stock of Pacific oysters in Puget Sound. They look a bit different. We'll have a comparison chart in the next slide. We'll compare the two differences. But these are more oblong. They have a taller shell, more pronounced ridges, a deeper cup. They get much larger. I don't know if they ever submitted it, but an oyster that would have won the Guinness Book of World Records was harvested from Drayton Harbor, right there on the U.S.-Canadian border, on the order of 13.5 inches. So they get very, very large. They grow very quickly, and they're very desirable in the market. So here's a comparison of Olympia oysters, the native oyster, to Pacific oysters, the introduced oyster. In the half shell, which unfortunately if you find one on the beach, don't just open it up to figure out who it is, but in the half shell you can see that it's got a smooth rim around both valves, or what we call the sides of a shell, bivalve, two shells. Here it's more kind of fluted or more intricate, where they have interlocking teeth along the edge of the valve. Additionally, the Olympia oyster is flatter. It doesn't have a lot of frills coming off of it, and it's almost symmetrical. If you draw a line down the middle, it's almost symmetrical compared to the Pacific oyster, which has these frills along the growth. And if you look down, if you cut it in half, it's not very symmetrical. It's more oblong to one side. So those are a few ways you can tell a Pacific from an Olympia. One of the main ones is if you see an oyster, it's likely Pacific, but if it's large, it's definitely a Pacific. There are some small populations of Olympias around. They're typically a lot harder to pick out. Moving down the tide line, this is the Manila little neck clam. There's two little neck species in Puget Sound in the Salish Sea. One is the Manila little neck. This is a non-native clam that was introduced accidentally, probably with the transport of Pacific oysters. But this is the favorite steamer clam. If you ever go to a restaurant and order steamed clams, you're getting little necks, again, 95 to 99% of the time. I've only gotten the native little neck once, and that was up on Quadra Island. But most of the time you're getting the Manila little neck, because this is the one that the aquaculture industry raises. They raise these critters, versus the native little neck, because they grow quickly, they live a little higher on the tide line, and they're a lot easier to raise. They're also a bit more palatable. They live longer out of the water. They're a little bit more robust. We'll do a comparison of the two here as well, but I'll point out the differences. One, they look almost identical at first glance. One of the differences you can tell from a Manila clam is they have these ridges going up. This is the siphon side of the clam. They have these ridges going up on the siphon side of the clam. They're a little bit more oblong, where the native little neck we'll see is a little bit more round. And the dead giveaway is if you have the clam facing this way, so if you put the ridge side facing up, the umbo towards your chest, on this lower part right here, if you run your finger across it, it's indented along here. So the hinge is on this side, the opposite side of the hinge. There'll be an indent. On the native ones, there's a ridge you can feel with your thumb. And these Manilas, their limit on distribution in the Salish Sea is driven by water temperature. They are adapted to warmer waters. They'll survive just fine in our waters, but they won't spawn. That many clams, including the Manila clam, temperatures have to hit a certain threshold to trigger spawning. And in many of our bays, the temperature does not get warm enough to trigger spawning. And so you'll have, so they grow fine in the aquaculture industry because they hatch them on shore, spawn them on shore, wait for them to settle out, and then spread those seed clams on their tidelands. In warm bays, you'll find naturally spawned Manila clams. And because of this, you often see a cycle in the spawning of Manila clams, where once every 3 years you might get a warm summer, and then Manila clams will spawn and go crazy. Those clams will survive in the environment for 4 or 5 years. Another warm event, another spawn, clams go crazy again. And so there's kind of a cyclical nature to them, which is sort of interesting as well. Now, looking just like them is the native little neck. Now, these are the native species. They live a little bit lower on the tide line. They can get a little bit larger. They're very abundant up and down the coast. And these are what would have been consumed, 500 years ago. They're still very abundant and still very important today. A lot of folks don't differentiate between them when they go out and dig clams. They just it's got the right sort of shape. So it must be a steamer clam, and they don't even necessarily use different words for them. One way you can tell, another way you can tell the difference between a manila clam and a steamer clam is manila clams had these ridges that go from the umbo to the commissure. The umbo is kind of the butt of the clam, the little round part. Commissure being where the two valves or shells come together. There's ridges that run this way. On the native little neck, you have those ridges, but you also have concentric rings going around it as well, which are not as evident in the manila clam. So that gives the native little neck clam more of a thatched appearance. And then again, the dead giveaway that will never fail you is rubbing on the opposite side of the umbo, or opposite side of the hinge, that there's a little peak in there. There's a little rise. And so it's one of those tricks where you kind of have to have two clams side by side, but you can feel that little rise on the opposite side of the hinge, which manila clams have an indent there. Cockle clams, I put them next on the tide line. They have a pretty broad range, and they're in a slightly different habitat, so it's a bit artificial, but they're generally, we're still kind of in the upper mid intertidal range, and cockle clams are more abundant in flatter, muddier kind of eelgrass beds. They're very desirable for harvest. The Coast folks really highly prize cockle clams, and in fact, there's a partnership with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund that does a lot of aquaculture for restoration, and a couple Coast Salish tribes around bringing back more cockle clams because we've seen a decline of them over time, particularly over the past 10 or 15 years, causing concern. They're a pretty different clam. This image doesn't show it as well, but they have teeth, and their shells, what's called tooth, where it has like interlocking ridges. So if you imagine having two sides of the clam, two valves of the clam, and you're trying to twist it left and right, trying to rub the shells against each other, they won't move because the left and the right valve, the two sides of the clam, actually interlock with these little teeth that kind of bind together. And they have a more muscular body to them and less kind of goo, you might say. But they have very short siphons, so they have to live right on the very surface of the sand or mud. You can frequently just see the end of the clam sticking out, and so to harvest them, you can just walk up and down the right beach, and you'll just see them sticking out, and just go pick them up. It's quite nice. Down a little bit bigger is butter clam, Saxodomus gigantica, another native species. Very important very important clam. Shell middens are full of these. This is definitely one of the staples of Coast Salish shellfish or butter clams. They get quite large. These get much larger than the prior species we've mentioned, and they dry and preserve really well. And so butter clams were highly prized from the Salish Sea and traded up and down the coast and traded far inland as well. So you could string clams up, dry and smoke them, and they would preserve for a very long time. Now, similar to the varnish clam, butter clams can retain biotoxins for quite a while. In particular, they retain a toxin called saxitoxin that's associated with paralogic shellfish poisoning. And what saxitoxin does is it stops your nerves from firing, which prevents your involuntary muscles from working, things like your lungs and your heart. Obviously not an ideal situation. So they can have a very nasty toxin in them, but they're still generally better than the varnish clams. And they can be found in the lower third of the intertidal zone. So now if you think about upper, mid, low, now we're mid to low. So here, if you want a butter clam, you have to have a good tide. You couldn't go out on kind of any random day. You need to wait for a really good tide to go out and dig your clams. And you would go out and dig a ton of these, process them, shuck them, dry them, smoke them, and store them. They were also extremely important foods during the winter when other fresh foods were not available. During those good low winter tides, you could go out and dig butter clams. They were also likely the most important species that clam gardens targeted as well. Horse clams, now these are often mistaken for geoducks. They're not a geoduck, it's a different species. Horse clams live on the low tide line, so you need a good low tide to go get one. They have kind of a triangular shape to the shell, and one way to tell a horse clam from the other species we mentioned is the clam cannot pull its siphon or neck all the way into the shell, and so there's a large gape in the shell. There'll be a small hole in the side of a butter clam where the siphon is, a very small hole, but they can pull their siphon all the way in, where a horse clam frequently does not. It has a very large open gape, and the shell doesn't really close all the way around. And these are also deep in the sediment, meaning if you're just out there with a small little plastic shovel, you're likely not going to run into these. You have to dig down a good foot or so to find a horse clam. My friends at Lummi love horse clams. Lummies are sort of known up and down the coast as people who love horse clams. And one of the major pieces of meat here is actually in the neck, where you blanch it and then pull the exterior skin off, and then you can dice the siphon and mix it in with clam fritters is pretty popular. You mix it up with flour, egg, and some onion, and then fry them, and kind of like a crab cake almost, but clam fritter. And these can live quite deep in the subtidal as well, but we typically think of this as deeper intertidal clams. And the geoduck, so geoduck takes the horse clam to an extreme, and so here there's no way the siphon is fitting inside of this shell. And geoducks are much deeper on the tide line. These are another native species. You would need the best lows of the year to go get these, and even then it's quite the operation, where you have to dig about 3 feet into mud. Now, digging 3 feet in your backyard is not that big of a deal, but digging 3 feet in mud is an issue because as you dig down, it slumps in. And so people that go out and dig these bring a barrel and they like squish it in, kind of push it slowly down into the sand, and then dig out from inside of the barrel, and the barrel holds the sides of their hole up to dig down to obtain one of these geoducks. Geoducks can be very long-lived. I believe the oldest one is 168 years old. And similar to trees again, they have an annual growth increment. And that annual growth increment ties frequently quite well to chlorophyll or sea surface temperature. So looking at what's called sclerochronology, which sclero meaning like skeleton, hard parts, chronology meaning time, looking at the growth increments of geoduck, you can reconstruct past climates because these things live to be 168 years old. And they can tell you about climate variability as it relates to clam productivity. These are extremely valuable in the commercial market, and almost all there's two forms that they show up in the commercial market. One is aquaculture, and so Lummi actually has a shellfish operation where they spawn geoduck and they sell what they call seed clams, tiny clams about the size of a bean. So you can buy a bean-sized geoduck from the Lummi aquaculture, plant it on your own tidelands, let it grow out for 4 years or so, harvest it and sell it in market. The other way is wild harvest, and these are divers go down and they carry what's called a stinger, which is basically a fire hose, and they find a geoduck and they hit it with a stinger, which blows the sand away, and then they can reach in, grab the clam, and pull it out. Economically, these are worth about $25 a pound to the fishermen, which is a lot. It's called ex-vessel price, and so they're extremely valuable critters, and they've been consumed for quite a while. I'm embarrassed to say a big hole in my clam repertoire where I've never dug a geoduck. All these other ones I've quite familiar with, but the geoduck I've never gone out to dig one myself. And so frequently you're walking down the beach, and particularly if it's a good low tide, you're walking along the beach, something like this comes at you and shoots you in the face with water, and somebody says, "Oh, it's a geoduck." Or you're walking on the beach and somebody's digging for clams and say, oh, I got some gooey ducks. And in my experience, they've always been wrong, unless they've got the barrel and they really know what they're going for. But before you dig down, you can tell the difference between a gooey duck and a horse clam, because gooey ducks have this frill around the siphon, or they've got almost like a leathery plate that's kind of crusted over with barnacles and things growing on it. Where a gooey duck has two siphons, an inhalant and an exhalant siphon, and one's more round and the other one's a bit more oblong, but it's not nearly as leathery. It doesn't have the little frills on it that the horse clams do. So it's a fundamentally different siphon, which is pretty handy if you want to harvest one of these and you're going to invest an hour of your life to dig in the mud. You want to make sure you get the right one, and so knowing your siphon ID is a pretty critical part of figuring that out. So I've talked about these species in order from high tide to low tide. Of course, there's a bit of variation and overlap within that. But in general, this is the order that you'd expect to see them as you walked from the parking lot down to the bottom of the ocean. Varnished clams up top on the Olympia oysters, Pacific oysters, Manila clam, little neck clam, this being the native little neck clam, cockles, butter clam, horse clam, and gooey duck. So it's a brief kind of touch on a variety of clam species, both native and non-native. With that, Haishka, thank you.